Hello and welcome to this event on hydrogen. We're delighted to be putting this on with the Environmental Defence Fund. And we've got a great panel to discuss both the advantages and limitations of hydrogen. I'll introduce them in a second, but let me first of all set the scene. In the last decade, one of the biggest changes in the debate has been the growing prominence of hydrogen as a potential part of getting to net zero. We all know that right now we've got to get to an economy that's more efficient, where we electrify large parts of transport and heating. But where we can't electrify, hydrogen could play a very significant role. But while I think there's a consensus that there is an important role for hydrogen, there are big debates and arguments about the scale of that hydrogen contribution and where it should be best focused. So most recently, we've had a lot of interest and lobbying and suggestions about hydrogen as a way of decarbonising home heating, which is a big focus of Nesta's work at the moment. So with us to debate those questions about the technological potential of hydrogen, where it should be best focused, are three people who've got a huge amount to contribute. First of all, from the Environmental Defence Fund, we have Stephen Hamburg, who's the Chief Scientist, and Alyssa Ocko, who's a Senior Climate Scientist. And we have Paul Wheelhouse, who's the former Scottish Government Minister for Business, Innovation and Energy. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a second. Let me just say that in terms of the format of this, we're going to have a range of questions from me. Please do put your own questions and comments in the chat, and I'll try and bring them in. And particularly towards the end, I'll try to focus more on questions from you. So, Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself first of all?
Great, thanks, and really appreciate being here. So I'm Stephen Hamburg. I'm the Chief Scientist at the Environmental Defence Fund. I'm an ecosystem ecologist and spent the bulk of my career as a professor at Brown University, where I looked at the impacts of climate change. And over the recent past decade, I have focused very heavily on understanding the implications of methane, which is equivalent to natural gas, on both the climate, where it's being emitted, and how we can mitigate it.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Paul.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Paul Wheelhouse, a former Minister in the Scottish Government, as it says on the slide there. I have spent 9 years in the Scottish Government up till the May elections this year. And about 7 of those years, I've been involved with either looking at climate change as a climate change minister, or latterly the last 5 years in my role as energy minister in the Scottish Government. And what I've seen is a huge transformation in the energy around hydrogen itself, the debate around hydrogen in that time, not even talked about really as an option back in 2012 to 2014. When I was attending conference of party events in Doha and Warsaw, through to 2016, the first sort of discussions as energy minister with the Hydrogen Association here in Scotland. Maybe had a couple of meetings a year. By 2019, I remember having 4 meetings in a single day, 2 of which involving overseas governments. And by 2021, clearly we've got huge commitments from European governments like France, Germany, in the billions of euros, and Scottish Government. And we published our own, I'm not part of the Scottish Government anymore, but the Scottish Government published its hydrogen policy statement. I was pleased to lead that work back in December last year, and are developing our hydrogen action plan. So pleased to take part in this event, and it's going to be very interesting to hear EDF's views on the role of hydrogen from a scientific perspective.
Thanks very much, Paul. And Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Alyssa Ocko. I am a senior climate scientist at Environmental Defence Fund. My research focuses on improving both scientific and public understanding of the climate impacts of our actions in both the near and the long term. So our actions in terms of what we emit into the atmosphere are often analyzed and framed in terms of their long-term benefits only, which can lead to overlooking any near-term climate impacts. And so on one hand, this means we could be missing opportunities to slow down warming in the near term, which is what we've seen with methane. But on the other hand, we could be pursuing actions that lead to more warming in the near term and not even realize it. And so my work looks at the climate impacts of our actions over all time scales so that we are as fully informed as possible and can make the best decisions. And so this is where hydrogen comes in, because hydrogen is a powerful but short-lived indirect greenhouse gas. And so the way we have generally understood its climate impacts is through this long-term impact, but it has a lot larger near-term impacts than people realize. And so my work is trying to understand the near-term impacts as we scale up hydrogen use in the near future.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and welcome to all of you. I want to actually start with that last point, Alyssa, that you were mentioning, which is the nature of hydrogen, because I think we tend to have this rather optimistic view of hydrogen. There's a huge amount of hype about it without necessarily understanding how tricky it is as a gas. It's both it is a cause of climate change, but it's also difficult to handle because it's leaky. Can you explain to us a little bit more about the challenge of hydrogen and its climate impacts?
Absolutely. So scientists have known for decades that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, which means that it doesn't warm the climate itself in terms of trapping heat, but it increases the amounts of other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so that's how it contributes to warming. And so we also have known that hydrogen can trap a lot more heat than carbon dioxide for equal mass. And we also know that hydrogen is short-lived in the atmosphere. So more work could be done to refine these details further, but what all of this means is that it's clear that if hydrogen does leak into the atmosphere, which one, could easily conceive of because it's such a small molecule, it can significantly undercut the climate value of fuel switching from fossil fuel systems to hydrogen applications in both the near and the long term. The near and the midterm. The biggest unknown here is how much hydrogen is leaking from infrastructure. And that will determine how much of a climate benefit we end up getting from deploying all of these clean hydrogen applications.
So can I just unpack some of that, Alyssa? Because I think one point I want to understand a bit more about is the scale. So you said that it contributes indirectly. Can you give us a sense of how much? And also you mentioned that it's short-lived. So one question to you on that is, well, do we need to worry if it's short-lived? Because I think a lot of people who do know that hydrogen has climate impacts will then say, well, it's negligible or short-lived. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So to answer your first question, the latest research suggests that hydrogen, for the same amount of CO2, can trap 200 times more heat than CO2. And so that's a lot. And right now, we're not emitting a lot of hydrogen from our hydrogen applications because it's a relatively young industry. But as we look to scale up hydrogen further, that amount of heat that could be trapped if we leak a lot of hydrogen could play a major role. In terms of your second question, which I'm blanking what that was again.
About this, how short-lived it is, because
yes, yes. Thank you. So basically, it depends what we care about. I mean, if we only care about the climate in 100 years from now, no, the hydrogen leaking right now is not a big deal at all. And the hydrogen that we leak in the next 30 years is not a big deal. But we care about climate change over all time scales. We are seeing catastrophic events occur all over the world right now. And so we don't want to end up in a situation where we're making the climate worse in the near term, even if it's going to be better in the long term. We need to, we want to maximize our climate benefits both now and in 50 years from now and in 100 years from now. And we need to take all of that into consideration when looking to scale up hydrogen.
I might just add that just from a time frame, it's 2 to 3 years. So you emit a molecule of hydrogen, it's going to persist in the atmosphere for 2 to 3 years on average.
Got it. Now, the other thing, just to sort of frame the debate, was you mentioned leakiness. So I think probably many of us think of hydrogen and compare it to natural gas, particularly when you think of heating homes. Just say a little bit more about the difference between hydrogen and the natural gas we all use.
Well, natural gas is almost entirely comprised of methane, and methane is a larger molecule than hydrogen. And we've seen methane can leak from all sorts of infrastructure along the oil and gas operations and the natural gas supply chain, especially from pipelines, for example. And so there's every reason to believe that hydrogen will leak, if not just as much, maybe even more throughout the infrastructure. For example, when you compress it or when you store it or when you transport it through pipelines, it could very easily leak. And the problem is that we don't know how much is leaking, because while we certainly are detecting leaks for safety concerns, which is incredibly important when we're using hydrogen, and that is a very, well-developed field of research in terms of monitoring those big leaks, we don't know how much the small leaks are. And we've seen with our methane research over the past 10 years that those small leaks that were being undetected when you just focus on safety actually added up a lot and made a big difference on the climate. And so we really need to start measuring and monitoring leakage of hydrogen throughout the entire value chain.
Great, thank you. So we've sort of set the scene with a bit of a warning or a bit of caution about hydrogen, but I think your message and Stephen's message is not that hydrogen is something to avoid. It's about what's the right way of using it in the right place and not overclaiming. So I think the next question, Stephen, I'd love to get your view on is, given what Alyssa's just said, what is your view about the scale and focus of hydrogen use, and where should we be definitely relying on it, and where should we perhaps be ruling it out?
Well, I think we should use electrification wherever we can. And what we really need to think about hydrogen is in those applications where that isn't possible. So the industrial sector, steel manufacturing, things like that, and use it in a very compact way, meaning let's produce it, use it in a very small geographic area, so we're not moving it around. The challenge we have with hydrogen is the more that we move it, the more that we handle it, the more likely we are to lose it. And there's really good reason to believe that those losses, as Alyssa said, can make a big difference relative to the net value of using hydrogen to decarbonize on the climate. So we want to think about it as a hub approach. And then as we gain more confidence and more data, we can expand those uses. But we have to be careful because hydrogen is a difficult gas to deal with because the material you use to carry it is not straightforward. It can embrittle metals. It can, as Alyssa said, it's a small, what referred to as a slippery molecule. So as we've seen with natural gas, as Alyssa mentioned, it's easy to start with a tight system and end with a loose one that allows lots of emissions. And so we need to better understand how we can deploy hydrogen outside of a very compact area if we're going to effectively do that beyond this sort of narrow use. And right now we don't have the data to be able to begin to think what that might be.
So that's very clear. And just on the idea of using things in clusters, that's because you don't want to transport hydrogen longer distances because that increases the risk of leakage. Can you just say a bit more though about what do we know about how to actually make sure that hydrogen doesn't leak? Aren't there good ways of basically building infrastructure and pipes in a way that is reassuring in terms of the risk of leakage, or is that something we don't really understand how to do well?
Well, I think in first principles, what we want to do is think about just really paying attention. In industrial settings, you tend to focus a lot on the processes, you're monitoring it, and with high degree of monitoring, with high precision instruments, you can make it tight. The more you make things like our natural gas infrastructure currently under our streets, there's very, very little monitoring of that. Things can go wrong quite easily. And again, we've been very focused on safety, which is critically important, but not on leakage. When you look at those leakages, they're everywhere. So what we really need to do is think about what settings can we really do that kind of intense observation, build the knowledge, and then with that knowledge, we can figure out where else it might be appropriate to use it. But we also have to remember that hydrogen takes a big energy penalty because we're producing it with a lot of energy, that if we can use that electricity, renewable electricity directly, we're far better off. We get far more work done. So we only want to use it where we don't have alternatives to electrify, which is home heating can be electrified. Almost all transport. There's some really exciting work on even heavy duty trucks. So there aren't that many places right now where we could say hydrogen is really the perfect fit for what we need.
So there's a big debate, Stephen, that in this country about how you get us off gas use in homes for our boilers. And the UK is unusual in the way in which we have a national grid. We've got gas pipes into everyone's homes. And the nice thing that people who argue for using hydrogen in homes say is, well, it will require less behavior change and change the fabric of homes. You don't need to insulate them better or have bigger radiators, as you might need to do with air or ground source heat pumps. You can maybe substitute your gas boiler for your hydrogen boiler. Now, the implication of what you're saying is very much against that, I think, for two reasons. One, your argument is that if you're going to generate electricity and you can pipe it into a home, if you send it into a home, then that's much more efficient than converting it into hydrogen, particularly given the efficiency of heat pumps, which might be 300% efficient. That's one argument. But the other argument is this one about leakage and the climate effects. So are you saying that even if hydrogen was cheap and plentiful, you think right now it's a dangerous assumption to think that we could pipe it into homes without it leaking?
Well, I think that assumption is certainly not the logical one. And I think that if we look at the efficiency and conversion, right behind me, you can't tell, there's a heat pump, and it heats this 120-year-old house that I live in, and it works really well. And it required almost no conversion in this house, so it was very easy to install. So I think we overestimate the difficulty of actually electrifying even old houses. The technology is pretty amazing. And again, you can do so much more directly with electricity than if you go through hydrogen. So the rate at which you can decarbonize is much greater with a heat pump or electrification strategy than it is with a hydrogen strategy. And the other thing is there's some new data coming out. I can't remember if it's going to be published today, in the next week, showing that if we think about the alternative natural gas versus hydrogen, how much natural gas is leaked in the urban environment. We've not done a good job of that, but if we go and look at your home boiler, most of those boilers have a certain amount of leakage that are associated with it. We don't have any data on whether or not hydrogen would perform the same. There's reason to believe it should. So that it's not just getting it in the pipe, it's how you use it in the house. And we have lots of evidence to suggest that little bits of leakage associated with hot water and boilers, when you multiply it by the number of houses, adds up to a very big number. We can't afford that amount of hydrogen being leaked in the atmosphere, because that will have a big negative effect versus using things, as you say, like heat pumps.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm going to turn to Paul now, because I'd love to get your take on the best use of hydrogen. And I'm particularly keen to get you to weigh in on this heating question, because I think one of the conventional wisdoms in the heating debate in the UK is that we might need different ways of heating homes in a low carbon way in different places. So you might have district heating and heat networks in urban areas. You might have electrification through heat pumps in others. And you might have hydrogen in certain contexts where there may be a hydrogen cluster. That's quite a conventional UK view, and which Stephen, I think, is cautioning against for two reasons. But interested in your take on the best use of hydrogen.
Yeah, it's been fascinating, Robbie, to listen to the discussion so far. I mean, certainly, I don't doubt the advice that we're getting from two esteemed colleagues about the science of hydrogen. It's very interesting to hear that. But I suppose we've got two challenges globally and certainly locally with Scotland's very ambitious greenhouse gas emission targets. That is pace. The pace of change is very dramatic. You rightly identify there are aspects of hydrogen which attract politicians because of the behavioural aspects of this, that you minimise the disruption and change to people's way of life. That's obviously an attractive thing from a political perspective. But we obviously have to listen to the science as well and get the balance right, as others have said. So yes, there's a real interest in clusters. We are doing some pioneering work in Scotland on demonstration of use of hydrogen in Orkney, the archipelago of islands to the north of Scotland. And that project, there are two particular projects, Big Hit project and Surf and Turf, both European and Scottish government and UK government funded projects, have looked at using grid-constrained electricity to convert that into hydrogen. So that's electricity, to pick up Stephen's point, that would have gone to waste. It could be used. And the wind resources there, we are a very windy country. Orkney is a very windy part of a windy country. and therefore it has abundant renewable energy opportunities, and with tidal and wave energy being trialled there as well, huge potential. So it's how do you overcome grid constraints that up to now have prevented that power being transmitted to Scotland's mainland and to the rest of the UK. So hydrogen is provided through the maybe the necessity being the mother of invention, has provided an option here for using hydrogen as a storage and transmission vector, if you like, for power, and allowing that surplus electricity to be used. The idea is then to integrate that into use in ferries and other transport uses. So there's vehicles in Orkney Islands that are using the hydrogen already, small kind of Twingo vans or Renault Twingo vans, and some transit vehicles, slightly larger vehicles. In Western Isles, where hydrogen has been produced from landfill gases, it's being utilised in a refuse transfer vehicle, a bin lorry, for want of a better phrase. And so Stephen's right, sort of heavy goods vehicles, there's a bit of a debate to be had about what is the most appropriate technology to use. There's obviously a challenge where particularly when talking about cargo being transshipped across Europe. The charging times for large batteries and large heavy goods vehicles would probably make services uneconomic, or at least that's the conventional wisdom, and therefore hydrogen potentially has a more attractive role to play in offsetting the need to carry a very heavy battery all the way from start to finish of that journey, and just to maintain the behavioural patterns that we can already see with heavy goods vehicles at the moment. But I do think one of the challenges we have in Scotland and the rest of the UK, as an example, in the electrification challenge, in very old kind of urban areas we have, is how do we shoehorn in the upgrade in electricity we're going to need, electricity infrastructure we need into urban areas, densely populated areas, at the pace we need it to happen to achieve our 2030 targets and the 2045 target for Scotland, 2050 target for UK. And that is a huge multi-billion pound, indeed, very many billions that would be required to do that. And the average street in the city of Glasgow, which will host COP26, if we're to put 2 or 4 high demand, rapid charging battery chargers on those grids, they would melt the wires. We would have a real challenge in those tenemented areas with high population density, allowing people to use electric vehicles. So that is something that is being done in partnership with government and the power companies in Scotland. There's some really good work happening with Scottish Power and Scottish Southern Energy to do that. EDF, the other EDF, I should say, who are involved as well. So that is a challenge. It's how do we do that quickly enough, Ravi, to enable us to hit our targets quickly? So I think CCC's advice, the Committee on Climate Change UK, is taking a balanced view, and they're saying there's a role for hydrogen, there's a role for electrification. We need all of it. So it's not a case of choosing one or the other. We need everything if we're going to hit targets early enough to prevent damaging climate change. I did wonder though, and maybe this is where Alyssa and Stephen can really help us, is around the science of storage and transshipment of hydrogen, because that's certainly something that's been assumed in the models I've been looking at and the models the UK government are looking at for offshore wind deployment, for example, to produce hydrogen and then tranship it to then inject it into either the gas grids, maybe 1 to 2% initially. I know some countries are looking at up to 20% hydrogen in their heating mix, their gas mix. But if we're not using hydrogen in that way, can it be used as a derivative like ammonia? That's been suggested as potentially a replacement for marine fuel, for example, for shipping. So can we make use of the resource to produce something which is derived from hydrogen, which avoids some of the challenges of storage, perhaps reduces the leakage and enables us to use hydrogen in a more targeted way? I think I very much agree with Stephen around big industry, needing hydrogen. And we saw £1 billion commitment from INEOS to decarbonise Grangemouth, Scotland's only refinery, just this week. And that's with a view to using what's called blue hydrogen, combined with the CCS project up in the northeast of Scotland, to decarbonise the production of aviation fuel and petrol and diesel. So we are in a transition. We've got to be smart about this. We've got to deploy things at the right rate and in the right way, and try and avoid some of the challenges that Alyssa and Stephen have highlighted. But I just wondered whether ammonia or methanol and other derivatives might actually be more useful in certain uses.
Stephen, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Paul that using hydrogen as a feedstock or as energy transfer system, it can be a good potential way to do that. But we also just have to remember that the amount of potential leakage from using blue hydrogen of methane, right? So upstream methane can easily, without using existing systems, now we don't have enough numbers in the specific cases that Paul's talking about, could mean that there is no net climate benefit for the systems he's talking about for a couple decades. So that no benefits, you actually have disbenefits. And so that's the kind of problem we have to work through, and we need those numbers. And on the methane side, we have a lot of data. We're building it ever quickly. We're expanding those databases. We don't have them for hydrogen. But we have to remember blue hydrogen has upstream leakage, and it has a big potential impact. And supply chain emission rates across the globe are multiple percents, and that starts to be material in terms of undercutting the value of hydrogen, blue hydrogen, in decarbonization over the next couple decades. So there's a tension between speed. We want to do it rapidly. There's a political commitment, which I applaud. That's fabulous, to decarbonize, and we don't, in the process of that rapidity, want to end up having a perverse outcome because we've used systems that in fact are not reducing the net radiative forcing, the amount of heat that's accumulating in those near to midterms.
And if I could just add really quickly, methane suffers the same analytical timescale challenge that hydrogen does. So hydrogen, as we said, only lasts in the atmosphere for a few years. Methane lasts in the atmosphere for around a decade. But the way that we are valuing the climate impacts of these short-lived climate pollutants is by looking at their climate impacts over the following 100 years from just a pulse of emissions right now, which means that we're accounting for a lot of warming when it's not even in the atmosphere doing any warming. And so we need to use better metrics and approaches when we are considering the climate impacts of both green and blue hydrogen. And this relates not just to the hydrogen leakage, but also the methane leakage, because right now, the way life cycle assessments do the modeling, they are underestimating the impact of the methane leakage in terms of the climate impacts over the near to midterm. And so that's also a problem.
And I might illustrate that for just a second, and how we got into thinking about methane a decade ago is I actually drove a CNG van because it was the environmental thing to do when I was a professor. I taught a field course. And so we bought the CNG van and used it, and I realized I didn't understand the implications of methane losses along the supply chain to get that CNG into that van. When we actually did the analytics, what we discovered is, yes, it was over 100 years, it was net positive for the atmosphere. But it turns out it took 85 years to get that point. So over my lifetime and my daughter's lifetime, I was damaging the climate in order to get a benefit for if I ever have great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren. And that wasn't a trade I wanted to make. And the analytics totally didn't make that clear. I thought I did the right thing, but I didn't make the choices that in fact I really wanted to be making.
Can I come back in, Ravi, if possible, just because you mentioned about clustering and localized solutions, and obviously I've mentioned Orkney, but we have got a project I think we've got an opportunity to try and learn from, and maybe there's areas of collaboration with scientists such as Stephen and Alyssa could be fruitful. The H100 project in Methil, which is funded by Ofgem, Scottish Government and industry, is looking at creating a 100% hydrogen heating network for 300 properties in an area of Fife. Now, that's a very small project in absolute terms, but it's going to be looking at potentially the problems and challenges that arise, and to demonstrate the technology in practice, working with partners like Worcester Bosch and others to look at the boiler technology. There are, as has been rightly said earlier on, you mentioned, I think, Ravi, yourself, opportunities for district heating networks. So you rather than have individual boilers as well, you have a community heating system. We just passed legislation on that just this spring to put in the regulatory framework for that. Now that potentially allows you to have much better monitoring of the heat engine, if you like, on the network, and to make sure that it's not only safe but also not leaking hydrogen. But I just wonder whether maybe we've got a phase. I suppose we've got time. While I'm talking about pace, we've got time right now in an immediate period to do the research and to understand better, the extent to which there are leakage issues at the end use point of hydrogen, whether it's in the automotive sector, whether it's in the heating opportunities, whether it's in shipping, and to try and get a proper handle on that. And it is interesting hearing the kind of timescales about the short-term effects of hydrogen and methane in the system. Because I remember as an environment minister back in the day pushing for peatland restoration as a means of CO2 emission reduction. And that's still something we're actually throwing more and more money at in Scotland, and I'm sure internationally that's happening as well. But of course, when you repair degraded peatland, initially emissions go up. And it takes several years for it to come back down. Then it becomes a net negative. So there is a timing issue for everything. When you plant forestry, it takes several years for that to actually kick in, because of obviously any plant growing will be sequestrating CO2, but it reaches its peak at a later point in its life cycle. So there are real timing issues we need to understand, and I suppose when governments around the world are trying to phase in different technologies, understanding how they interact with each other at different points in the timescale, so you don't involve two technologies going forward to create a big wave of CO2 emissions at some point, or heat being trapped at some point in the very tight timescale we've got to control temperature increases to less than 1.5 degrees.
So, I think the implication of Alyssa and Stephen's point is arguably that it's a straightforwardly bad idea to be piloting gas in people's homes for heating purposes. You could just say for efficiency reasons and leakage reasons, it's just a bad idea. Now, I think there's so much momentum and hype around hydrogen, including for heating homes, that's not going to be enough to necessarily stop that momentum. So I'm just wondering, what's the kind of research that needs to be done to understand particularly the leakage likelihood and its effects? So what's the next research that you're looking to do to sort of get a finer resolution on these points?
Yeah, so Paul, really warmed the heart of a scientist, right? Doing pilots, doing observations is the key. I'm an empiricist. I want to look and see what's really happening. So it doesn't concern me if you're doing a pilot with 300 homes, because the net effect of it, positive or negative, is going to be relatively minor. But that's the opportunities to really learn. And that's the kind of data we currently don't have. But what's key there is to not assume what the outcome is. To say, look, we have to try this out. Here's an idea. We can, I always like to say, I can bet positive or negative on these. The point is not, as a scientist, not what I think is going to happen, is what does happen. So what we need to do is get that kind of data and then make sure that we really understand the implications and decisions that policymakers are going to make about whether you go forward deploying that. Now, I believe we have enough data to suggest what the outcome will be, but that doesn't matter. What really matters, as I said, is what's actually observed and how replicable it is. Because in experimental conditions, as we all know, drug trials and things, it's easy to come up with in the lab something that looks really powerful. Unfortunately, when you put it out in the real world, it isn't always as successful. So we've got to figure out what can really be effective. And also what the net value to the climate is. To the point Paul made, is we have to look at this as an integrated time interval, and how do we do different things and how do they fit together. And certainly restoring peatlands as an ecologist is a wonderful thing to do, but absolutely, it's a very long game. And it's not going to be the thing you do to solve the climate crisis in the next 20 years.
And if I could just add, in the meantime, while we're collecting all this data, we know enough about the physics to start including hydrogen leakage based on plausible leak rates into our life cycle assessment modeling when we're comparing the hydrogen applications to the fossil fuel systems they're replacing, or the hydrogen applications to direct electrification, for example. So all of that science is very well established, and so we can start including that into our assessments of using hydrogen for different applications, and we can use better methods to evaluate the climate impacts over all timescales as opposed to just over the long term, and that will start to help inform our decisions going forward, while we also in parallel are collecting this data to really understand how much is actually leaking.
Thanks, Alyssa. I want to bring in one or two questions from the audience. So Josh Barnes has asked about whether hydrogen leakage could be a long-term as well as short-term problem if it contributes to precipitating climate change tipping points. So Alyssa, I don't know whether you want to cover that.
Sure. So in terms of the hydrogen leakage being a long-term problem, it depends on the counterfactual world that we're talking about. So the CO2 is such a big deal because it builds up over time, and so commits us to warming over really long timescales for generations to come. So when we swap out fossil fuel systems that would be emitting a lot of CO2 for hydrogen, the hydrogen, because it only lasts a few years in the atmosphere, is not building up over time and committing us to long-term warming in the same way. So you have to look at it in terms of the benefits of what the world would have been like if we were still using the fossil fuel systems as opposed to the hydrogen, which means that as time goes on, there's a lot of CO2 that we would have prevented from building up in the atmosphere. So that's one way to look at it. But if you're comparing hydrogen to other alternative options, such as direct electrification using renewable energy, yeah, the hydrogen could increase radiative forcing more, which would increase warming more relative to this other world we could have with more direct electrification. And then that, yes, could warm the earth more, which will get us closer to these tipping points. The tipping points are still really, the thresholds are really uncertain. So it's kind of a risk assessment. Like they're very high risk situations, but we don't know when it could happen, but there could be really bad outcomes. And so yes, anything that you do to increase the radiative forcing would lead to higher risks of potentially disrupting those major systems.
Great, thank you. There's also a comment from Tom Schuller about scale, and you know, Paul, you were talking a lot about scale and pace of the hydrogen deployment. The question here is, what's the size of the contribution hydrogen could make to greenhouse gas reduction in different sectors? And I think that's important because if I think about the government, the UK government's committed to trying to get to 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2030. I think it's worth understanding what's the sort of scale that we need to be aiming for in the long term, given the need to decarbonise those hard to electrify sectors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right to pose it that way. Certainly from the point of view of the work we were doing prior to the election and leaving office, we were looking at a situation where we knew, for example, that Germany, because of its industrial base, to pick up the kind of, if you like, the most attractive use of hydrogen to decarbonise big industries that we need to continue post transition. We reckon that Germany needs between 90 and 110 terawatt hours worth of hydrogen per annum. Now, the 5 gigawatt figure that Scotland has committed to by 2030, 5 gigawatts worth of installed capacity for production of hydrogen, we'd be looking at something in the region of, I'm just trying to find my figures, I think it's in the region of 17 terawatt hours. So that gives you quite a substantial figure there. For example, Scotland, which is renowned for its investment in renewable energy, certainly in onshore wind, we have about 8.4 gigawatts worth of onshore wind capacity at the moment. So, you know, more than half of that would be required to produce electricity to generate 17 terawatt hours worth. So you can see the kind of scale of challenge that somewhere like Germany has. So what I haven't done yet, and I apologise to Tom, is convert that into what that means in terms of our commitment to our percentage reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. All I know is that CCC, the UK's Committee on Climate Change, says that it's given advice to UK government to have about 90 terawatt hours in place by 2035, which is quite a short time scale for that kind of scale of activity to be put in place. That's about the equivalent about 1/3 the size of the UK's power sector, for example, for producing electricity. So that's the kind of magnitude of investment that's required, and to meet our commitments around electrification and decarbonisation of industry.
So if I can just add on to that, when we talk about percent greenhouse gas reductions, you need to compare and add up all the greenhouse gases together. And because the role of each greenhouse gas individually depends on several different factors. It depends on how potent it is as a greenhouse gas. It depends on how long it lasts in the atmosphere, and it depends on how much we're emitting. And so when we factor all those things in, that's when we get these climate metrics, and many of you may have heard of global warming potential. And this is where the time horizon issue comes into play, because when we're comparing all these greenhouse gases together, so we're not just looking at, for example, the CO2 benefits of switching from a fossil fuel application to a hydrogen application, but we're considering the methane and the hydrogen leakage as well. We need to put all these gases on an even playing field. We use these metrics. They tend to have this value judgment of a long-term time horizon, which undervalues the near-term climate impacts of the methane and the hydrogen. So when you see a lot of these numbers of, oh, we could reduce emissions by this amount, there's almost always a value judgment baked in there of the time horizon over which you're comparing the climate benefits that you're getting from fuel switching. And so it's a technical point, but it's actually really important and something that people don't realize. And so especially with the assessments that exist right now that are comparing your greenhouse gas reductions for projected growth in hydrogen for different sectors or different countries or the overall economy, you are in almost all cases not including hydrogen leakage. And when you do include hydrogen leakage or methane leakage, you are severely undervaluing the climate impact over the next 10, 20, even 30 years. And so that's really important to note about existing assessments that are out there. And that's something that we need to improve on going forward, so that when we look at the greenhouse gas reduction benefits of using hydrogen, we are looking at the climate impacts overall timescales and comparing that.
Great, thank
Can
you.
I come in briefly?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, an important thing to sort of triangulate, I suppose, on these points is taking Alyssa's advice around the fact that these, the short-term impacts aren't being accounted for properly. Is that, and this may be something that will come up at COP26 around, the commitments that governments are making are all very fine, but where's the legislative frameworks in place to make sure they commit and keep to those targets? Now, Scotland, we may have made a rod for our own back, but we have annual statutory greenhouse gas emission targets, which take into account issues like aviation and shipping as well, I should say, which is quite unusual internationally. But I know from previous discussions with officials, they do try and take into account issues like emissions of, fugitive emissions of methane, for example. Unfortunately, the North Sea itself is not included in Scotland's targets. That's a UK extra region that's been created for statistical purposes. So that's included in the UK government's targets. But I know the industry has to get rid of about 18 megatons per annum, and hence electrification is the way they're likely to try and do that, to try and get rid of the production emissions for producing oil and gas. So there are lots of gaps in the inventory, I think, that are slowly being filled, including our understanding of peatlands, for example. But we do need to get to the bottom of those kind of issues that Alyssa's raised. I think that's an entirely fair point. And then if you have got a rigorous statutory framework in place, then governments have to hit their targets annually, not just in carbon budgets over a period of time, but annually. And therefore that provides the kind of, if you like, the political rigor that's needed to keep the figures in totality, including the figures that Alyssa alludes to, under the targets for each year, so we don't build up a kind of cumulative emissions problem.
So I'll just add a quick thing. So completely, Paul, that's fabulous, and the kind of commitment that Scotland's making is really tremendous. But we do have to remember, to Alyssa's point, just put it into a nutshell, make sure that our metrics align with our goals. So right now we tend to use CO2e, which is 100-year pulse emissions, to solve a 2050 goal. That's a mismatch. That's sort of like saying, I want to plan for my retirement and I'm going to use a 100-year time frame. Well, none of us are really going probably to be around in 100 years, and it's not going to work. We have that kind of mismatch right now, and we need to make sure that we start to think about we're measuring and reporting the greenhouse gas impacts relevant directly to the goals that we've set for ourselves.
Is there an alternative single metric, Stephen, that you think should be part of our debate?
We've actually published on that. Alyssa led an article. I'm not sure there is, but we often use multiple metrics. So when you get your blood pressure, you don't ask for one number. When you look at the efficiency of your vehicle, you don't get one number, because you're not using it in only one context. But we think there's some ways of doing it with two numbers and other ways so that you understand this trade space. And again, it's not always simple, but it's allowing folks like Paul in government to make the right informed decisions. Say, okay, here's what's going to be, and the peat example is a wonderful one. No, in the short term, that's not a good solution, but it is a long term, and we're going to make some of those. That's important. Restoring those peatlands is critically important, but we do have to recognize the short term disbenefit. So yes, you can use what we call a 20-100. So you do the contrast. What's the near term impact? What's the long term impact? You understand when they're not the same.
Great. I want to turn now to what do we need to do, or particularly what the governments need to do in the next 10 years to prepare for larger scale deployment of hydrogen in a variety of different contexts in the 2030s and beyond. Stephen, and Alyssa, you've already talked about the need, for instance, for more piloting and research to get a better handle on some of the questions you've raised. But what else do we need to be doing in the next 10 years to actually prepare the ground? And what I'm particularly interested in here is how do we make sure we hedge our bets to some extent, but also open up certain options? Because sometimes if we don't start investing now, we're not going to have the scale of production required to meet our climate change targets in the 2030s in particular.
Well, I'll start with just no regrets. We all could agree, and let's use it in the hard to decarbonize industrial sector. Let's get that experience there. Let's do it in ways that there really are no viable alternatives, and start deploying. And while we're doing that, let's collect the data we need to really understand the implications of a broader scale application. That would give us a no regrets path forward, but it ensures we do it in a disciplined way so that we don't end up with the kind of problem that Europe ended up with diesel, right? With getting out ahead of the knowledge. So what we need to do is figure out what do we know well, deploy against that, and there where we're less certain, develop the data to make wise decisions. And that can be done in the time frame that's necessary. This is not something that has to delay good action, but it does have to require discipline rather than using hydrogen in so many different places with so many large capital investments with the assumption that many of them are going to be bad.
Are there any particular risks of lock-in to hydrogen use that you're worried about governments making right now?
Well, as I said, I'm all for doing a test of 300 homes, but I would be very concerned if we made a commitment to a large-scale distributed hydrogen system. Again, I can't say it won't work, but I can say I think we have enough evidence to suggest that's going to be very risky in terms of the climate benefits.
And in terms of the relative investment in blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, what's your view on that?
Well, as I said, green hydrogen, it's purely, as long as we're not displacing available renewable energy from direct use, can be a really positive if you manage the leakage. For blue hydrogen, we have to make sure that we have a very tight supply chain, which we should do either way, because the methane emissions is getting greater attention, represents a significant impact on the climate, and the single most powerful thing we can do to reduce the rate of warming in the near term. So we've got to do that, but that has to be built in before you could really consider using blue hydrogen, because otherwise you undercut the value significantly.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Paul, what's your take? I mean, you've been right in the midst of policy making in the last decade. With your perspective now, what needs to happen over the next 10 years?
Well, I think there are a mixture of things that need to happen. There's some immediate moves that can be made to increase the role of hydrogen. Presumably, ideally, as has been said by Stephen, producing green hydrogen, but potentially as a short-term measure, blue. To inject more hydrogen into grids. I think Germany is a higher percentage, for example, than the UK, something like 0.1% in the mix at the moment, but it could easily be increased to 1 to 2%. That's something that's proposed for St Fergus gas terminal up in the northeast of Scotland, where much of the, I think it's about a third of the gas that enters the UK system comes into St Fergus. Hydrogen could be injected in at that point and then around the network, taking into account Alyssa's point around leakages and have to be accounted for, and make sure technologies improve, pipeline infrastructure is improved to reduce leakage. But that was one thing, but that would require regulatory change to allow that to happen, because there's a cap on the amount that can go into the grid at the moment. It would have to be lifted. H100 is perhaps the other end of the spectrum with 100%. there's more likely, I guess, to be a potential up to 20% to go into the gas mix. Again, that will require government to consider that very carefully and to regulate the gas market safety regulations to ensure that's done. Then you have to put in place the policy frameworks to support it, the financial incentives to get the industry up and running, the investment in science and research to ensure that any of the problems that have been identified by Alyssa and Stephen are tackled, and it might be in parallel areas like graphene and other areas where perhaps storage can be improved through these kind of technologies to allow these very small molecules to be contained. So that's not something that's in my purview. I'm not a scientist, but I think we need to see investment in the science, investment and time spent in Parliament and getting regulation in place, allow regulatory change to happen that will allow some innovation to take place and allow us to test the concepts. And then there's collaboration, I think, is perhaps in the UK particularly, we need to think very much about reviewing our approach. It was quite isolationist at the moment, and start looking about collaborating again with Europe, with the rest of the world, on identifying appropriate technical standards for the use of hydrogen, make sure that safety standards are uniform, that we understand the technical parameters of things like pipelines or electrolyzers to make sure they minimize leakage of hydrogen, and understand, as I said earlier on, some of the potential other alternatives like production of ammonia using hydrogen. That has its own risks, of course. That's a toxic chemical, can kill people. It's explosive, but then again, so is natural gas. So it's about understanding what's the best use of hydrogen and can it be used as a in derivatives as well.
Thank you. I'd also just like to pick up, Stephen, on the question of what R&D funding should be doing to support the hydrogen transition. What are the areas where governments should be investing heavily in innovation?
Well, I think we need to learn from the challenges we've had from natural gas, that we didn't have built-in monitoring systems, and we're only now building them after the fact. So there needs to be a monitoring system integral to any development of hydrogen. And to do that, we need cheaper, better technology for measuring hydrogen with greater precision. And that just needs to be required. You just put it out, so you always know, and then we get a constant learning. And obviously, we need to work on the metrics. We need to be able to make it really simple for someone to calculate what the relative advantages or disadvantages of using different kinds of decarbonization strategies. We shouldn't be arguing about it. We should have very robust technologies in the sense of softwares where you can come in and say, I could do path A, B, or C, and you really understand those implications, not over 100 years, but continuously. What's the 20-year impact, 30-year impact, 40-year impact? Then you can match your metrics directly to your policy. What are you trying to accomplish? Does this do that? And that's a relatively easy lift, but unfortunately, we're not doing it.
Thanks. We're drawing to a close now, but if anyone wants put any further questions in the chat, we can try and capture them. There's one from Derek Young that I wanted to bring in, which is, does the global warming impact matrix or others also take into account the infrastructure we need to design and build to roll out use of alternative energy sources such as hydrogen? Alyssa, I don't know whether you want to take that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it can. It certainly can. I mean, when you talk about the global warming impact of a gas, for example, hydrogen relative to CO2, you're talking about it in terms of kilogram per kilogram. But then when you use these life cycle assessments, it includes how much emissions you then have of any of the relevant climate pollutants that are being emitted. And so if you include the climate, any climate pollutant emissions from building infrastructure, you certainly can include that in your assessment of one technology versus the other. And so it's very easy to do that in a sense. You just have to make sure, like Steve is saying, that the metrics are appropriate and done properly so that you're comparing the climate impacts of all the relevant climate pollutants like CO2, methane, and hydrogen over time. And so but you can certainly include the impacts of infrastructure, recycling, all sorts of things can be included.
Thanks. I want to just end with one final question for Paul. To particularly ask him about the benefits of a move to a hydrogen economy and how we capture those. Because if I think back to the shift to offshore wind, and renewable sources in the UK, we could have done more if we'd have acted earlier to actually capture the sort of employment and economic benefits of that shift. What do you think government should be doing right now to make sure that opportunity doesn't go wasted again?
It's a very good point. I think some of the, if you like, the gilding has come off the green revolution, sadly, because public perception is that the jobs haven't arrived that have been promised by governments of all stripes for decades now. And that's really unfortunate, because we need the public right behind us, because there's a trade-off here. They're having to change their lifestyle in many ways, in some cases, that we talked about earlier on. But if there's jobs that come from that, then it's more acceptable. It's more of a kind of a trade, if you like, a balanced trade between difficulties it creates for the public, but also the economic benefits. So we have to recognise there's going to be a huge expansion across Europe, I presume the rest of the world, and electrolyser capacity that's required. We could be doing work now through certainly Scotland, the supply chain development programme that's led by the Scottish Government, working with the enterprise agencies to try and identify diversification opportunities for companies, perhaps in areas like oil and gas, to get into manufacturing electrolysers. And certainly we're seeing sectors like oil and gas throwing a lot of money now at offshore wind auctions to try and win contracts to then produce green hydrogen. So there is quite a considerable kind of momentum now behind the industrial transition that we need across all developed societies. But we need to recognise that it's something that needs to be worked at. It can't just be allowed to be left to happen by accident. It's going to take collaboration, and to some extent that might require governments to accept that. Obviously some degree of public support is required to get things off the ground, because obviously in the context of trade agreements internationally, there's concern about subsidy and unfair competition. But we all need to do this simultaneously. We can't have every single electrolyser produced in one country in the world. It has to be produced around the world. So there needs to be a degree of collaboration and acceptance on the part of all governments that there needs to be a bit of domestic first kind of approach to some of these technologies. And investing in research and development and innovation clearly is an important part of that, to try and deliver this technology in the most efficient way, reduce emissions as fugitive emissions as the list is raised, but also do it in a cost-effective way, so that the price of the product ultimately is low enough that it can be accepted quickly by industry, by consumers.
Thank you very much. It's interesting, whenever you have a debate about a particular technology, we often end up in a situation where people are either big advocates, hyping it up, or very much against it. What's been really good about this conversation, I think, is we all recognise there is quite a big role for hydrogen. There are some no-regret measures and sectors you could invest in now, but we also need to take a more sort of evidence-based approach to how it rolls out in other areas. And I think, Stephen, your point about more R&D and around measurement, so that we can have more real-time understanding of the effects, and Alyssa, your point about the right metrics that inform those decisions, I think is so important to make sure we get the decisions right in the next decade. So thank you very, very much for your contributions today. This is one of a series of events we're doing on a sustainable future, which is one of our 3 big missions as an organisation. So do watch out for more in this series and in Nesta Talks too. And we'll be also doing things in and around COP26. So watch out for those. Paul Wheelhouse, Alyssa, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to all the audience who've joined as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you.
care. All the best, guys.